The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at his threadbare coat as he huddled deeper into the flimsy shelter of the overhang. Snow lashed his face, each flake a tiny needle. He'd seen plenty of winters, but this one felt different, heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then he saw her, a dark shape against the stark white, barely breathing, a horse too old, too broken, to be out here. A foolish thought, maybe, but in that frozen, silent moment, something in him shifted, a quiet whisper of a chance he didn't know he needed. Dusty Dust Callahan had seen better days, and so had his ranch, what was left of it. The sun, when it bothered to show its face, bleached the already parched earth, highlighting the cracks in the dry creek bed. His nearest neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled prospector whose face was more wrinkles than skin, was usually good for a yarn and a cup of lukewarm coffee. But today, Hemlock was nowhere to be found. Just the usual creak of the windmill and the distant, mournful low of a steer. Dust was mending a fence, each swing of the hammer a rhythmic reminder of his solitary existence. When he heard it, a sound out of place, a faint, almost human moan carried on the wind. He stopped, hammer poised, listening. The sound came again, a desperate, fading cry. His gut tightened. Wolves weren't uncommon, but this sounded different. He grabbed his old Winchester, a trusted companion through countless lonely nights, and headed towards the sound, his boots crunching on the brittle, frozen ground. His mind, usually a quiet pool of calm observation, raced. What could be out there? A stray calf caught in a thicket, or something worse? He pushed aside the familiar, comforting routine of his day, the steady rhythm of ranch life, and stepped into the unknown. The closer he got, the more the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled heavy in his chest. Then he saw it, not a calf, not a wolf, but a horse, half buried in a snowdrift, its breath misting in ragged puffs. It was ancient, its ribs stark against its matted coat, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. An old, weary mare on the verge of succumbing to the brutal cold. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that leaving her was the only logical choice. But his calm, observing mind, usually so practical, was battling something else, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The winter storm was brewing, and he knew a decision had to be made, and quickly. The worst was yet to come, and this horse, this dying creature, was suddenly at the center of it. The Mari was a ghost, a living skeleton against the deepening snow. Dust knelt, his gloved hand resting gently on her neck, feeling the shallow, erratic pulse. Her eyes, clouded with age and pain, held a flicker of something, a stubborn will to live that surprised him. He tried to get her up, grunting with effort, but she was too weak, too heavy. The rising wind began to whip the snow into a frenzy, obscuring his vision, and he knew he didn't have much time. He couldn't just leave her. The thought gnawed at him, a splinter under his skin. He decided on the only desperate plan he could conjure, a makeshift travois. He struggled back to the ranch, grabbing 2 long, sturdy poles and a canvas tarp. The return trip was a brutal fight against the elements, the wind biting at his exposed skin, the snow blinding him. He worked feverishly, tying the poles to the Mari's sides, the canvas beneath her, creating a crude sled. He was losing control of the situation. The storm was intensifying faster than he'd anticipated. Just as he finished, a figure emerged from the swirling white, a lone rider on a hardy roan. It was Elias Vance, a rancher from the next valley over, known for his shrewdness and his unforgiving nature. Elias dismounted, his gaze cold and assessing, first at Dust, then at the dying horse. "Callahan," Vance's voice was rough. "What in tarnation are you doing?" Dust just grunted, pulling at the travois. "This horse, she ain't gonna make it." Vance's words, short and cutting, hung in the air, heavier than the snow. Dust knew it was true, but he couldn't stop. "Gonna try," he muttered, pulling harder. Vance scoffed, a cloud of vapor in the frigid air. Fool's errand. You'll lose your own hide out here for a broken-down nag. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken judgment. Dust felt a familiar sting, a reminder of all the times he'd been told he was wasting his time, his efforts. He pulled again, the effort straining his muscles, and felt the travois shift a few inches. Vance simply watched, his silence communicating more than any words. As the last light faded, swallowed by the raging storm, Dust realized he'd lost more than just time. He'd lost the certainty of his solitude, his self-imposed isolation now punctured by the unexpected presence of both the dying horse and the judgmental Vance. The journey back to the ranch was a nightmare. Every step was a battle against the rising snow and the sheer weight of the travois. The mare, surprisingly, still clung to life, her labored breathing the only sound besides the wind. Dust's muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed on, a stubborn ache in his own chest mirroring the animal's struggle. As he leaned into the harness, a sharp pain shot through his shoulder, and a memory, unbidden, flashed through his mind. The feel of a young boy's small hand in his, guiding a spirited pony across a sun-drenched meadow. His son, Ethan. The image was vivid, almost palpable, and with it came the familiar crushing weight of grief. Ethan had loved horses, had dreamt of riding in rodeos, of the wide open spaces. Dust had encouraged him, taught him everything he knew. But then, the fever came, swift and merciless, and stole the boy away, leaving Dust with nothing but a hollow echo in his sprawling, empty ranch. He'd retreated then, from the world, from people, from anything that could cause such pain again. He'd buried his grief deep, under layers of work and silence, letting the land become his only companion. Now, with the old mare struggling behind him, her fragile life hanging by a thread, the buried emotions began to surface, a raw, burning ache. The flat plains of his ranch, usually a place of stoic solitude, seemed to stretch out endlessly, mirroring the vast emptiness he often felt inside. The storm, too, felt different here, more personal, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. He was no longer just dragging a horse. He was dragging a piece of his own shattered past into the present. He gritted his teeth, the pain in his shoulder intensifying, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let another living creature, especially one so helpless, simply fade away on his watch. He had a choice to make: follow the bitter reason of his past and abandon the horse to its fate, or let his broken heart guide him through the raging storm. The barn, though drafty, offered a semblance of refuge from the relentless blizzard. Dust had finally managed to get the mare inside, laying her gently on a thick bed of hay. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed, but she was alive. He was exhausted, every bone in his body aching when the barn door creaked open, admitting a blast of frigid air and the imposing figure of Sheriff Brody. Brody, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as a granite slab, stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Callahan," he began, his voice low but firm, "there's a report of a rustler operating in this area. A gray mare, old, with a distinctive blaze. Sounds an awful lot like the one you just dragged in." Dust felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This was it, the confrontation he'd been dreading. Brody had always been fair, but he was also uncompromising. "She was half dead in the snow, Sheriff," Dust said, his voice raspy from the cold. "Just trying to save her." Brody's eyes narrowed, studying the mare, then Dust. "Saving a horse or hiding stolen property, Dust?" The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Dust felt a surge of anger, but he kept it in check. "She's not stolen. Found her out there." "Seems mighty convenient," Brody countered, his hand resting on the holster of his pistol. "I heard tell you've been having some trouble keeping your ranch afloat." Each word was a calculated blow, striking at Dust's deepest fear. His inability to keep what was his, to protect what little he had left. The tension in the barn was palpable, each breath a silent challenge. It felt like everything he had fought for, everything he believed in, was about to be taken from him. He met Brody's gaze, a quiet defiance burning in his eyes. "You gonna take her, Sheriff? Just let her die out there." The question was a desperate plea, but also a test. For a moment, everything seemed lost. Brody's face remained impassive, a mask of unyielding law. Then, a sudden, unexpected whinny ripped through the silence. The old Mare, with a burst of unexpected strength, lifted her head, her eyes fixed on Brody, a low, rumbling sound emanating from her throat. It was a sound of protest, of defiance, a sound that seemed to speak of a deep, ancient wisdom. Brody, surprised, took a step back, his hand falling from his holster. The sound, almost a plea, seemed to cut through the hardened shell of the sheriff, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something akin to understanding crossed his stern face. The Mare's unexpected defiance had changed everything. The confrontation with Sheriff Brody had ended, not with an arrest, but with a lingering silence, a truce born from the Mare's unexpected intervention. Brody had left, his gaze still questioning, but his purpose softened. Dust, however, felt a deeper kind of wound. His body ached from the physical exertion, but it was the emotional toll that truly weighed him down. He sat on an upturned bucket beside the Mare, who now lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. The only sound was the soft rustle of her breath and the mournful creak of the old barn. Even surrounded by the familiar scent of hay and horse, Dust felt profoundly alone. The brief exchange with Brody had exposed the raw nerve of his isolation, the years he had spent pushing everyone away. He reached out, his calloused hand stroking the Mare's matted mane. She nudged his hand gently, a small gesture that spoke volumes. It reminded him of the quiet companionship he'd once shared, a bond that transcended words. He knew she was still teetering on the edge, one hoof in this world, one in the next. He had given her warmth, food, and a place to rest, but her spirit, her very will, was what truly held her here. A thought, unsettling yet strangely compelling, began to form in his mind. He had to get her to a real vet, a specialist, someone who could truly heal her. But the nearest one was a 3-day ride, and the journey would be perilous, especially with a weakened animal. It was a risk, a huge one, of losing what little he had left, his time, his dwindling resources, perhaps even his own life. He looked around the barn, his gaze falling on an old, tarnished silver horseshoe hanging above the stall door. He remembered nailing it there with Ethan, a symbol of good luck. Now, seeing it, it wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a renewed sign, a silent challenge. This Mare, this creature he'd found half dead in the snow back in Chapter 1, now carried a new meaning, a chance, a fragile opportunity to mend something within himself, something far deeper than any fence or broken bone. He rose, the pain in his muscles a dull throb. The decision was made. He would take her, no matter the cost. As he prepared for the journey, a mix of courage and doubt churning within him, Dust knew the desolation of the open road awaited, and with it, the final act of this unexpected, life-altering journey. The journey was a blur of harsh wind, endless plains, and the constant, rhythmic thud of the Mare's hooves against the frozen earth. He called her mercy for the small measure of compassion he'd extended, and for the greater mercy he felt she was offering him. Each sunrise brought a fragile hope, each sunset a renewed fear that she wouldn't make it through the night. He talked to her, whispered stories of Ethan, of his own lost dreams, of the quiet despair that had become his constant companion. And slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted. Not just in the Mare, who grew stronger with each passing mile, but in Dust himself. The rigid lines around his mouth softened. The distant look in his eyes began to recede. They finally reached the small town, a collection of dusty buildings huddled against the vastness of the land. The vet, A no-nonsense woman with kind eyes examined Mercy and shook her head in disbelief. "She's a fighter, this one," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Mercy, against all odds, would live. But the journey hadn't just been about saving a horse. As Dust watched Mercy graze in a small pasture, her coat gleaming in the pale sunlight, he understood. He hadn't just given her a second chance. She had given him one. The years of self-imposed isolation, the crushing weight of grief, began to lift. He was still the same man, weathered by time and sorrow, but the emptiness inside him was no longer absolute. The old wounds remained, but they no longer bled. He didn't return to the ranch the same way he'd left. He stopped in town more often, exchanged words with folks, even offered a quiet smile. His ranch, once a monument to his solitude, now felt less like a prison and more like a home. A place where a horse named Mercy found her footing again, and where a cowboy finally began to heal. As he sat by the fire one evening, watching the stars blaze across the vast, dark sky, he knew nothing would ever be exactly as it was. But as he looked out at the silent, sprawling land, a quiet peace settled over him. "Sometimes," he murmured to the dancing flames, his voice a low rumble, "the greatest healing ain't found in a doctor's bag, but in the heart of an old horse." And as the last ember faded, he knew his journey had just begun.